A Mighty Wind, The Annals of History, by Lord Blackwater. He who tells a bigger tale would have to tell a lie. Chapter 1. Booberry Pie and a 5-pound Turkey. He looked down. His hands and his groin were covered with blood. It was warmer and thicker than he'd expected. Stephen, the name they'd all given his wiener, had a steady stream of blood dripping from his tip. Stephen was still hard, but seemed unsure whether to stay that way or to shrivel up inside of Barnaby. Phelan laid in Barnaby's arms.
"It's okay,"
stammered Phelan as he coughed up blood.
"This is how I always dreamed of going. My people would be so proud. Tee-hee."
Barnaby cursed Phelan in his head.
"You daft fairy. I told you needed a safe word."
Barnaby had gone with nibbling gnomes and Nora had gone with flapping wind, but Phelan assured them he could take anything. But even he didn't expect the dead porcupine on a stick, and despite being greased up with Galdak smegma lube, it was still too much for the fairy lover.
"I'm raw, my loves. I can't thank you enough for that. Tee-hee.
Phelan's voice faded. He gave a final cough, spattering Barnaby's face with blood. It was over. A rag was thrown at Barnaby. He gently laid down Phelan's limp body and wiped his eyes of the blood and tears. Barnaby looked up to see Nora staring straight into his eyes, tears rolling down her face. Barnaby held her gaze for a moment, but slowly inched his eyes down to her uniboob. Despite the blood and death, he couldn't help but notice how glorious her uniboob looked glistening in her tears. Stephen was getting hard again. Barnaby opened his eyes. 4 years he'd been trying to strike white oil with no success. He'd tried everything, but remembering Phelan's death at the hands of Stephen and the porcupine was the only thing that got him even remotely close. That day he held Phelan in his arms was the last time he'd been able to come. Barnaby put away his creams and nipple clamps. He blew a kiss goodnight to Stephen and his minge. He wasn't going to get anywhere tonight. He laid his head back down and sighed.
How did it get to this?
He pondered out loud to himself.
"'Cause you fucked a fairy to death, you twat!"
Yelled a voice from above.
"So quit trying to punch the hamster and go to sleep!"
Barnaby knew full well how it got to this, how he ended up living in a cellar in Longville, the village beside Lake Blackwater. Sure, he'd saved this place years ago, but his image in Longville hadn't fared as well as the pristine waters of Lake Blackwater. The water still glistened in the lake as beautifully as it had the day he'd queefed the Nazi dragon Shartner back into the void. However, unlike Barnaby, the lake had never killed the beloved sex-addicted fairy Phelan. The villagers had a special place in their hearts and their assholes for Phelan, and his death meant that Barnaby, the one who could queef the mighty queef, was shunned by most of Longville. One by one, everyone turned away from him, and after about 6 months, even Nora had left him too. Barnaby thought back to the day he'd last seen Nora. She had caught him drunk in an alley, beating up a visually impaired asthmatic necrophiliac.
"Barnaby, I can't take this anymore. You're drunk again, and this is the 4th time this month you've beaten up an asthmatic necrophiliac,"
Nora said, exhausted.
"He never saw me coming,"
Barnaby slurred.
"This isn't a joke, Barnaby. Do you remember the day we rubbed each other with warm cheese? You blew blueberries up my pad muffin, and you told me we'd be together forever?"
Nora asked, almost begging him to remember. Barnaby looked Nora in the eyes as he gave the necrophiliac another punch to the wiener.
I remember the other day we made blueberry pie later.
"I'm leaving, Barnaby. I know Phelan's death was tough on the both of us, but I at least had the courtesy to leave the necrophiliacs out of it. I love you, Barnaby, but this is goodbye.
With that, Nalra turned and walked away. Barnaby lifted his head to protest, but he was too far gone and dropped his head back to the ground. The necrophiliac checked Barnaby's pulse as Nalra walked away. He was still alive, so the necrophiliac slunk away in disappointment. That was the last time Barnaby had seen her. Now he was stuck with his roommate Keldorf, the children's magician. It wasn't terrible living with Keldorf. His cock magic was unparalleled and drew in potential lovers. But having to pull magic coins out of his ass wasn't Barnaby's idea of magic. As Barnaby thought about this, a rumble came from his anus.
Not again,
Mumbled Barnaby to himself. He squirted a bit of Wizard Balder's lube onto his hand, and he reached around to his fanny hole. It took a while, but he eventually pulled out the 5-pound turkey.
Abracadabra, motherfucker.
Cried Keldorf from upstairs.
Next time, give yourself a Shane Dawson a little more quietly.
Despite being a pain in his ass on occasion, Keldorf was one of the last few villagers who would tolerate Barnaby, and the only one who was willing to put him up in his house after Nalra had left. Barnaby rolled over and placed the turkey in front of his quivering lips. He let out a gentle queef, which shot the turkey in an arcing flight into the corner of the room. He'd had a lot of time to practice his queef tricks lately. He laid his head down again, and he tried to think of any positives he had left in his life. He glanced over at the turkey and thought glumly,
at least I have something to eat for lunch tomorrow.